Wisdom, the final frontier to true knowledge. Welcome to Wisdom Trek, where our mission is to create a legacy of wisdom, to seek out discernment and insights, to boldly grow where few have chosen to grow before. Hello, my friend. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, your captain on our journey to increase wisdom and create a living legacy. Thank you for joining us today as we explore wisdom on our second millennium of podcast. This is day 1376 of our trek, and it is Worldview Wednesday. Creating a biblical worldview is essential to have a proper perspective on today's current events. To establish a biblical worldview, you must have a proper understanding of God and His Word. Our focus for these next several months on Worldview Wednesday is mastering the Bible through a series of brief insights. These insights are extracted from a book from the same title from one of today's most prominent Hebrew scholars, Dr. Micheal S. Heiser. This book is a collection of insights designed to help you to understand the Bible better. When we let the Bible be what it is, we can understand it as the original readers did and as the original writers intended. Each week we will explore 2 additional insights. Today's insights will cover mastering the Bible, the Old Testament Jesus, and his parables. So insight number 59 is, Gospel writers connect Jesus to the Old Testament in both transparent and roundabout ways. Since the New Testament begins with the Gospels, and Jesus is the focus of the first 4 books, we tend to think of Jesus exclusively in New Testament terms. That is too narrow of a perspective. The coming of the Messiah, the Son of God, is rooted in the Old Testament, not only in terms of prophecy, but also imagery. We've already talked about the most obvious ways that Gospel writers associated Jesus with the Old Testament, calling him the Anointed One, or Christ. Other transparent correlations extend from that messianic titles. The Gospel writers quote specific prophecies about the birthplace of the Messiah and the lineage of the Messiah. Less obvious, but still familiar, connections are made between Jesus and the Old Testament in other ways. When John calls Jesus the Word, the label is not original to him. The God of Israel appeared to the people of the Old Testament as the Word. And the title, Son of Man, had a royal messianic meaning. But the Gospel writers tethered Jesus to the Old Testament in cleverer, less overt ways. Matthew wants readers to identify Jesus with the nation of Israel. He accomplishes that through the story of Jesus' childhood. After Joseph and Mary flee to Egypt to escape Herod, Matthew quotes Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him. I called my son out of Egypt. And Hosea did this to recount how they returned from the promised land. But God's son in Hosea 11, chapter 1, wasn't the Messiah, it was the nation of Israel. Matthew used the analogy for several reasons. But one of them is Jesus had appeared on the scene supernaturally, just like Israel appeared as a result of a divine intervention with Abraham and Sarah. Israel would later pass through the sea and then the journey into the desert, where the nation would be tried and tempted. After Jesus' baptism, he was driven into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan in Mark chapter 1, verses 9 through 13. Jesus is also cast as a new Moses by the Gospel writers. When Moses was born, Pharaoh had all the infant boys killed. And Jesus was likewise threatened by Herod in Matthew chapter 2. Moses went up to the mountain and received the law, Exodus 19, and Jesus ascended to the mount to give his own law, the Beatitudes of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. The links back to the Old Testament are strewn throughout the Gospel. They also appear in other parts of the New Testament. Paying careful attention to how writers quote the New Testament, where Jesus goes and what he says at a given location, will help you to see these more clearly. Next, let's move on to insight number 60. Parables are puzzling but surprisingly consistent. It's no secret that parables present interpretive problems. A parable is simply a short story that has a double meaning. That is, there is an obvious meaning of the story, and then some more abstract meaning conveyed by the story. The stories Jesus told were very simple, so you'd think both interpretations would be easily discerned. But this is not really the case. Many writers, preachers, and Bible readers have approached the parables as though that they were allegories. In an allegory, all the characters, events, and objects of the stories have a specific meaning. But parables really aren't like that. More recent scholarship on the parables reject this approach since it's artificial and contrary to what you actually read in the Gospels. When Jesus interprets parables for his disciples, he usually zeroes in on one or two teaching points. He doesn't assign a meaning to everything or everyone in the parables. Jesus actually told his disciples why he taught the parables, and therefore he tells us. He draws out the reason by quoting Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, and he quotes this in Mark chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. And this is our passage from Mark. He replied, "You are permitted to understand the secrets of the kingdom of God. But I use parables for everything I say to outsiders, so that the scriptures might be fulfilled. When they see what I do, they will learn nothing. When they hear what I say, they will not understand. Otherwise, they will turn to me and be forgiven." What Jesus said isn't hard to parse. Parables are meant to obscure and reveal the kingdom of God, which is not so much a place as it is the status of being part of God's family and a follower of his good rule. Jesus taught parables to convey who he was and what God was up to by sending him. Believers would understand. The spiritually blind and hard of heart would not. As a result, when reading and interpreting parables, our eye needs to be trained on what they tell us about these things, how they reveal the kingdom of God and its king. The elements of the stories that do that are the important ones. Characters and components on the periphery shouldn't be assumed to have meanings or to serve as elaborations on the central idea in which we need to figure out. If we stray from what Jesus tells us to see in the parables, our unchecked imaginations will have too much influence over our thinking. And that will conclude this week's lesson on another 2 insights from Dr. Heiser's book, Mastering the Bible. Next Worldview Wednesday, we will continue with 2 additional insights. I believe that you'll find each Worldview Wednesday an interesting set of topics to consider as we build our biblical worldview. Tomorrow we will continue with our 3-minute humor nugget that will provide you with a bit of cheer, which will help you to lighten up and live a rich and satisfying life. So encourage your friends and family to join us and to come along with us tomorrow for another day of Wisdom Trek, Creating a Legacy. If you'd like to listen to any of the past 1,375 treks or read the Wisdom Journals, they are all available on wisdom-trek.com. And I encourage you to subscribe to Wisdom Trek on your favorite podcast player so that each day will be downloaded to you automatically. And thank you so much for allowing me to be your guide, your mentor, but most importantly, I am your friend as I serve you through the Wisdom Trek podcast and journal each day. And as we take this trek of life together, let us always live abundantly, love unconditionally, listen intentionally, learn continuously, lend to others generously, lead with integrity, and leave a living legacy each day. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, reminding you to keep moving forward, enjoy your journey, and create a great day every day. See you tomorrow.